Well, Chris is normally absolutely dead last, so I think we're probably ready to have a quick start and have a look round. Oh, we've got two Rob Claxtons again. I'll greet you all, and if you don't know, hopefully everybody knows us. I'm Rob, this is Dawn, and we're the Seasearch people. We've got a lot of nice people who've come in from other areas, so we put the invitation around quite widely. And hopefully this is interesting. We'd be very interested to hear if you weren't interested, as much as if you were, really. So if you're a non-diver from one of the wildlife groups, or you're a dyed-in-the-wool diver from another area, then it'd be great to hear from you and see whether this is interesting, or whether hearing about other people's accidents is just a nuisance and no fun.
Another person waiting.
Oh, another person, Mike C. We've had him before. Wasn't he in the Shaman? Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Okay. So there's so many of you now, I won't just say, oh, tell me stuff. I'll assume you're all quite interested, and we'll start from the basics. And what I'll do is I'll sort of share, let's share some Google Earth and describe the site a bit to you. Google Earth has just turned my screen completely white, so that was terrifying for a while. And Google Earth is normally a bit laggy, so you're probably just seeing a whole load of blue worms at the minute. I'm just zooming back out. So again, we're lucky we've got Rob Claxton here, who did all this nice bathymetry, this sort of seabed mapping, which has helped us a lot with Overstrand, because Overstrand is a funny place. If I try and center this, and I double check my laptop's plugged itself in. So all these blue tracks are GPS tracks, as though snails have gone diving at Overstrand and left us with their paths. And you can see there's sort of two ways in at Overstrand. There's down the zigzag path up at the west end, or there's walking down from Cliff Road.
No, it's not Cliff Road.
Some other road, down at the east end. And that tends to mean that the bit in the middle is for travelling, and we set out from either end, depending on our degree of confidence. It has to be said that of all the sites we dive, Overstrand is the one that seems to have the most sort of back-breakingly crippling walk back. I think that's not necessarily because it's super high, it just tends to present it all in one go. So I think it's a thing to be embraced. It depends whether you're a fan of the zigzag path down at the south end of town, the west end of town, or at the other end. So if we move in a bit, I can say that Rob Claxton's nice work on the bathymetry has helped us understand the layout of Overstrand. If I make the worm, well, I'll leave the worms. The blue stuff is a deep channel. Oh, I think we might have a new person just turn up. Oh yeah, had Graham just turn up. So Rob's nice rendering of the bathymetry has made a lot of things perhaps slightly more obvious. And it's given a clue as to the strange behavior of Overstrand, because as well as the fabulous walks up and down, one of the things about Overstrand is when the tide turns, it really turns, and it can feel like a monumental task to get back in. And we think that's because it has this deep channel here and this sort of bulge of shallow sand here. So as the tide goes out, because we normally dive this on high tide, because on low tide, the visibility tends to be very poor because the sand at this end of the reef is very, very fine. And I think it's pulled off the beach as the tide goes to low. And that wave action moves further in on high tide. So we dive it on high tide. We've popped in here after a nice dive in the morning at low tide. And by the time we got down to 3 meters, it was absolutely pitch black. The sand really does fly here. So what else does this mean? If you've not seen much more of this bathymetry, then this is an unusual sight. You can see the shallow fringe is really narrow and this deep channel is really close. And if I show you a bit over towards Cromer, you can see that normally the shallow bit stretches out a bit further. So we're back to Overstrand again.
And there's the big shallow bit behind the deep trench as well, out to sea.
Yes, yes. So Dawn's pointed out that this piece here is very shallow. The chalk comes back up again as you get off the shore. And we had a nice dive last year with East Anglian divers, and we were probably a couple of kilometres offshore, which is about twice as far as this band. This band is about 1 kilometre wide, just a bit over half a mile. And we were just over a mile offshore, 2 kilometres, and it was only 7 or 8 meters deep.
It was between 5 and 7.5, that's all.
Yeah, so it was super, super shallow. And I suppose more of a surprise than that, it's pretty clean chalk. So you could have a nice reef dive, very shallow, away from the shore conditions, and you had as much chalk as you could want. Not quite such big features as you get in shallow somewhere like Sheringham, but pretty nice all the same. So what have we done from the shore? So you'll see these lines stretching out, and if I bring up the measure, I can show you sort of how far we've gone. And mostly we sort of dive off the end of the groins, and there's the first one by the zigzag path, and then there are 5 down to this one at the eastern slip. And so if you're talking about diving, we often say, oh, well, we're going to the first groin or the 5th groin or anyone in between. So last year we dived a lot out of the 5th groin, and I managed to completely miss a very nice little reef, which is just here. There's not a whole lot of chalk at Overstrand, but part of its interest is that that's just one of a number of things that are there. The little reef is the prettiest bit, I think.
You think so?
Well, what do you like then?
I like the big boulders out of the west end. They're a long way out.
Yeah, so this trace here is typical of Dawn going for a dive. And you can see that's nearly 500 meters out. And so that's a good long swim, although part of that is beach and part of it's very shallow. And at that end, we get mounds of cast stone,
Yes.
we think. So it's a kind of craggy conglomerate, large mushroomy boulders that are easily undercut, covered in encrusting life. And they appear somewhere in this area. But not regularly, and they're hard to find.
Yes.
And again, this is a thing about Overstrand. Almost none of its habitats cover predictable areas. They can be covered or uncovered by sand, and there aren't a lot of landmarks around, so it can be quite hard to find them. It seems almost unforgivable, but last year I couldn't find the little reef here, even though the year before I found it multiple times. And whether that's just due to my poor navigation or whether there are huge sand movements, I don't know. So in the inshore, we see quite a lot of boulders, quite a lot of low chalk. The low chalk can have, I think, quite a lot of tubularia. They're little hydroids, and we've seen clusters of little nudibranchs on those, so they're good fun. And then beyond the reef and the fingers of chalk leading to it, as this gets deeper, it's really rather like a mixture between a gravelly riverbed and maybe a ploughed field.
Yeah, it's very strange clay deposits, isn't it? It used to be a lake, we think, in Ice Age times.
We've seen some what they call lamellate clay deposits. So it's almost like clay papers laid down one on another. So you can just brush them away with your fingers, but you can see they're thin, sort of slightly slippery clay layers. So there's a river there somewhere, and that's, to be honest, probably what that meandering blue is, some form of water-cut channel. And there's thick, hard clay as well, that breaks like rocks, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a little while. And on the sort of clean riverbed, just a plain of chalk, there's lots of gravel and cobbles, and there you tend to get quite a lot of dahlia anemones. We've had ampelesca, which is a very strange little crustacean that forms colonies that look like doormats. Just miles and miles of doormat. I think, unfortunately, I've managed not to include a picture of that tonight.
Well, to be honest, the pictures are not that exciting of that, are they?
Well, the pictures are weird, and I think it's nice to show people weird things. So I'm sorry, I've left out a weird thing. We can dig it up. Comment on the invitation to the talk, and we'll hear that. And if you need to see doormats, but it's very much like a sort of plastic doormat made out of sort of raffia. It's a very, very odd thing. So this is the layout of the site. You can see that you can get on to some very shallow stuff very quickly. It's quite plain sand. Then you get on to a variety of geological features soon after that. Nothing of any great size.
You do start to get some very big individual boulders if you can be bothered to swim out that far. And you can get to about 17 meters deep quite quickly if you go for it, but then it never gets any deeper.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful here and say that, like the flooded forest at Cley, the majority of people aren't set up for swimming long distances. So, what we think will be a very useful side effect of having this more detailed bathymetry is enabling us to discuss where things are with people, tell them it's 300, 400 meters out, and perhaps in concert with plotting your own dives with a GPS on a buoy, you'll be able to see how close you get and build up your own feel for sites. Because certainly I think at Cley, if you're on for something that's approaching a 20-minute swim, lots of people can feel a bit disheartened and stop quite close to the area they'd actually like to find. Because we track a lot of our dives, we've got a lovely track that Dawn did with somebody else where they got puffed out, they went up to the surface, can see the track of the GPS move around, avoiding the wood. And then when they decided they were ready again, they got back in, had missed the wood and came back. And it shows just how close you can get, because the reefs, which are very cute, are only about 40, 50 meters long. They're not very big. The riverbed area is probably the biggest. That's a big plain, but that's a good swim. That's probably starts 300 plus meters out.
The good stuff, yes.
And it's deep.
And you're time limited as well.
Yeah, by then you're time limited because, as Dawn said, there are pits here where you can get down to 17, which is really, really unusual for a dive off the shore off Norfolk. For the most part, I think 12 is more usual.
It's more manageable in the slack window you have.
Yeah, but you've had to do quite a beetling swim to get there, and with the current as so unpredictable and snappish as it is at Overstrand, there's a risk that you'll feel a bit panicked on the way back when you come back in. And so one calming thing I'd suggest here is that usually I'm still fixated on going north out and south back. And if you come south back at Overstrand, because the coast is beginning to come round and face more sort of southeast, if you swim south, you elongate your swim. So a swim back in from wherever you started, the swim back in is much better done southwest, because that will bring you in by the shortest route. And another thing to do is to surface when you feel a bit tired and puffed, because the water at the surface doesn't move like the water on the bottom. It moves faster as it's coming down into this dip. So now we've worried you, let's have a look at something more welcoming. Excellent, you're still here. There are people moving, they're not asleep. This is terrific stuff. Okay, so we'll excuse you a picture of us, and I'll share another screen, and this hopefully will be Picasso, and we'll show you some pictures of a typical, well, it's a typical 2 dives at Overstrand. And sort of, I've missed out just the plain sand, because I think you probably know what that's like. But I mean, I think sand can have its merits, and one of the merits is you get flatfish, because most flatfish don't like rocks. So this one has just been put up and isn't balanced on a rock. It's scooting past, trying to get away. And I'm sure all of you keen searchers, sea searchers, will know that that's a place, because it's got nice orange spots. So you do see that kind of stuff. On the way out, you see all kinds of pockmarked and weird rocks. I think this is probably a huge flint.
It is.
Flints are freed from the chalk. So the chalk used to be much deeper. As it's been eroded and dissolved and fishermen have knocked chunks off it, they've freed flints from it. And so flints tend to appear on the top, and they're very dense. So they don't move much. And you can see this one's well encrusted with barnacles, and sometimes of year we get flashes of little barnacle nudibranchs, and so even the rocks can be interesting. The rocks are shelter for some of the animals here, because there's not a whole lot of high-rise chalk. So they're often sort of shuttling between things and bits of shelter rather than setting up too much. Oh, I've got a sign saying more. Something must have happened. Oh, someone has chatted me. So Mike C has said, what sort of depth or distance from the beach does the sand start to break into rocks? And I would say categorically, I don't know.
It's very random. You can find big patches of boulders very close in, within 50 meters.
Yeah.
But they can be like 300 meters out before you happen to cross them.
Yeah, I think that the sand movement at Overstrand is considerable year on year. And so these pictures are from, I think, 2016 and 2017, when the sand had been dragged out. I think that last year the sand had been dragged in.
Yes, it was much further to get to anything, wasn't
And
it?
I had some really long swims where I saw nothing, absolutely nothing. It was good exercise.
And I saw something on every dive.
Yes, well, Dawn's a star like that and unbearable. Okay, Nick says, which way does the tide run? Parallel to the beach, or does it suck you into the channel? The tide always sort of runs parallel to the beach in North Norfolk, but I think because there's some element of it running into the deep channel, when it runs off, which would be going low.
Which is always when we're diving.
Which is always when we're diving, yes. So it would drag you to the northwest, which with a little bit perhaps more north than usual. So painfully, it drags you slightly away from the beach.
It is a bit panicky feeling, isn't it?
And it is counter to the direction you're trying to head, since you're trying to head south and it's trying to go northwest. So it is the worst kind of drag. If you start to head southwest, that will be more directly to the shore. Anyway, so we haven't really answered Mike's question. And I'd say, on the whole, you'd hope to see some stuff after about 100 meters.
Yeah, and it doesn't really break into rocks, does it? It's just where they're showing through, where the sand's been sort of divoted.
Yeah, some years you can get low chalk 50 to 100 meters out. Last year you did not. Last year I couldn't find the little reef, which I think is probably only about 250 meters out.
And it's dead north from that last groin as well.
It's dead north from the fourth groin,
Mm.
not the last groin. So this is always an area you're on for a bit of a swim. We like to be positive about that, and say that sand often hosts a lot of things, like, if we go on, I think eventually we'll see a cuttlefish, a flatfish, and other things about. So you make a virtue of it, but it's a bit of an oddity. This is low chalk, so just starting to expose, and the sand's not always there. So this stuff was completely covered last year, and some years it'll be uncovered better.
No, it's actually proper gullies sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, but unfortunately, you can see here the drop there is on that sand. So from one side of that fairly sizable boulder to the other, there's a drop of at least ½ meter of sand. And these waves travel. So you've got lots of little stuff, and that's really quite nice and fractal. You could probably sell wall art for B&Bs of the patterns that set up around rocks. But the big waves move with the whole tide, not just individuals, and they can roll through during a dive. So you can see stuff that will be covered during the next tide. This kind of thing happens at Weybourne as well, quite a lot in the sandy middle of the site. As I say, but on the sand you can see cool stuff, like this is a pog, and that's quite a rare little fish.
Oh, he's a tiny one. He's
a tiddler. This isn't a great picture, but this is a fisheye lens of a whole scene. So excuse the lack of detail. I'm just trying to prove to Dawn that it definitely is a pog. And he's one of the little fish that has lots of tubercles, almost like a beard underneath. And they whiffle their way through the sand. Until they decide to leave. There he goes. And then this is a fairly typical dive. There's a little cuttlefish. So I was seeing things this year. And then there's a sunstar down on this side, and you can see the chalk is starting to demonstrate that there would be gullies here if this sand was missing. Overstrand is normally a sandy site, so you just can't bargain on it being clear. But the white clean chalk is stuff that has been sort of covered, uncovered, and has been sanded down. When you start to find chalk that's encrusted, and this is chalk encrusted with tubularia, these are a kind of hydroid that you find nudibranchs on, you know that this is stuff that is actually bigger, at least under the sand, and is uncovered for more of the time, because animals, hydroids are animals, have had a chance to colonize it. And as you go further out, the chalk increases in size. And so these kind of formations of chalk, the kind of thing you'd see inshore at Weybourne, probably very close in off Salthouse, and they're more usually uncovered there. At Overstrand, the sand covers and uncovers these really quite rapidly. And I think perhaps it's that bigger body of deep water offshore that sort of brings stuff in with more enthusiasm and takes it away with more enthusiasm. Oh, more stuff. Oh, some dahlias. I think I've done one too many clicks. Oh, I haven't. So when you start to see dahlias and animals feeding, you'll think, actually, there's been time for these animals to set in. And you can see that behind here, there's quite a lot of mountainous chalk. And one of the reasons you might want to bother with Overstrand is that it has one of the steepest, highest reef faces of any site on the North Norfolk Reef. Some of the features are at Sheringham could be 3 meters high. So they're decent sort of 3 meter high gullies that end about 400 meters out. But this little sort of reeflet at Overstrand has a front which is probably more than 6 meters high. It's low at the back as you come out from the beach, maybe a meter, meter and a half high, and then you go over a big drop when it's fully exposed. And that's where you get nice stuff like sort of sponges all over these rocks. So various sponges here. Seaweeds starting to grow because they're not ground off all the time, resident crabs, and even resident shoals of large fish. Both the reefs, because there's 2 little reefs that are very close together. I'm not sure I've ever managed to swim from one to the other. I think I always get overexcited and just swim around the one I'm by. They both have deep ridges along the top. So they run, roughly speaking, east-west, and they have these deep ridges in them. And that's an unusual direction for any feature to run in the chalk off Norfolk. So I think these are probably massive pieces of chalk that have been rolled or tumbled or dropped on top of the main body of chalk. So they're unusual. That's all I know. You can see more nice breadcrumb sponge there, and there's always loads of crabs and lobsters larking around here. A crab, there you are. Just to prove it's not super deep. So I think that's where I'd just gone off the top and I was coming down the far side. So around 8 meters. You're looking for this stuff. There's some velvet crabs. Okay, I've got 10 minutes to chat. So I think that'll take care of the slideshow, and then we'll show you some more pictures of the layout and take more questions. Excellent. So dawn will time. So should be about 8:05. I'll pop out. Okay, now we're down onto more of the riverbedish kind of area where you're getting a gravel bottom as though it's been washed by streaming water. There we have lots of sun stars down there. This is sort of travels, I think. I think this is the completion of one dive where I'm heading back across the cobbles again, the big flint cobbles embedded on top of chalk. And this might be another one where I'm going past riverbed down onto the encrusted rocks again. The back of the reef, and I think this is from 2017 where I knew it was the reef. You can see a big gully down the top of it. Nicely lit, lots of bryozoan cover. It's yellow bryozoan cover, I think. Or do you think it's sponge?
I think it's sponge crust.
Yeah, sponge crust. We'd have to have a closer look. This is looking up the slope at the front of it. So this is down by the riverbed area, up to the top, and that is a 5 or 6 meter rise at that end of it. So it's a decent thing. And when you get big stuff that things can shelter behind, you get shoals of bib. So these are a shoal of little bib, and there must have been 3,000-4,000 of them. They were just buzzing around solidly around the big chalky boulders at the back. I'll click through these because although they're pretty, I'm not informing you of anything. Yeah, this is a bin bag. Overstrand is one of the areas where we think the fishermen throw in their waste in bin bags, bagged waste. And I've even seen sort of rotting lobsters with their claws rubber banded at sea pawling. So I'm not convinced the fishermen there are a credit to the industry. These are tubularia close up, so you can see what they're like. They're like a little jellyfish on a stick. Lots of crabs again. Drink again. I think it's sort of boat anglers and fishermen throwing drinks over again. Spare bits of wood down on the clay. And here we have a sequence of clay. So there's a nice corkwing wrasse on the clay. The holes in the clay are piddocks. They're drilled by a kind of mollusk, sometimes called angel wings, that has raspy wings, a bit like an abrasive mussel in white. So they're quite pretty. This stuff is clay. but it's hard rocky clay and actually breaks up in chunks. So there's areas around here that actually look like a moonscape where when the sand's cleared away from them. I'm zipping through to avoid too much complication. You can see that the clay here is hard, like a rock.
Henry.
It's a Henry. This is a bloody Henry, and it marks the end of our dive. So I'll come out of this, stop sharing, and we're back to us again. We've got about 7 minutes left, so I wonder whether we've got time to do something else. We probably have. I think what we'll do is I'll show another thing, and that's an annotated bit of our...
Okay, while you're looking, I could say it's worth going beyond that broken up dry clay, because then you get onto the sticky flat stuff, which has huge boulders sitting around in it. And if you like little tiny wildlife, then it's full of really unusual sort of squirts and crustaceans and things that we don't see anywhere else. So that's where you'd see the really tiny squat lobsters, the Galathea intermedia with the fluorescent blue spots on them, lots of Dendrodoa squirts, which are just like little orange baked beans, really unusual sponges, the Raspalia ramosa, the chocolate finger sponge, things like that.
And nut crabs.
Oh yes, I'd forgotten about them.
Now, if you need nut crabs, this is the place to go. It's not meant to sound as dirty as it did. Actually, it was to keep the thing entertaining. Anyway, so one measure of how severe the current is at Overstrand is that we've tried to do sort of GPS mapping here and had people carried away. This is a variety of plots from that kind of exercise. So I think the blue one is me. I swam out, intended to drift to the far end and came back. The yellow one is someone else. I think they just went, ah!
I think that's Stan.
No,
or is it Chris?
Well, let's not dog people in too much, and say that on the same day, at the same time, the red one is Dawn. So the current that carried people away was not a problem if you're focused. I think the problem is once you start to get carried away, you will go with it, and it's very difficult to make ground back again. But dedication and focus can keep you on plan. I intended to drift the length of the front. Some people didn't intend to have a dirty great walk back. So you just need to be careful. This one nicely shows what was called John's Reef, because John Chamberlain went out for a dive, told us of the fantastic reef he'd found, and his pictures were so poor we didn't believe him for at least 3 years until we found it again. And it's a 2-section reef. So I've decided the first section is John's Reef, and I found a better bit, so that's my reef. And you can see that one is straight off the end of the 4th groin. So that's a direction to it. North off the 4th groin, or slightly north-northeast off the 5th groin. All good stuff. Over here is where Dawn thought her conglomerate rocks were, and somewhere in here there's an aircraft engine. And with that, what we do with these talks, because we're too mean to buy the professional version of Zoom, although we might get to go with it for the photographic talk on Friday, is if we end the call now, and I'll restart immediately if you don't mind flicking back in. It means it stays free, and we can take some questions and round this up. We won't keep you very long if you want to get away. So that's nearly all the good stuff. I think we've probably got nearly everybody back again, including both Rob Claxtons. Excellent. Okay, so I'll go back to the one I just shared, because that's a nice, easy sort of thing to point at the layout. And so perhaps one of the sort of banal elements of any dive site is the practicalities of the whole thing. And people are asking how far the swim is, and can also say, well, where are the facilities? There's not much down at the east end of town. There's sometimes a portaloo, and annoyingly, there's actually a slipway down at the east of town with a little car park that you can get access to if you rent one of the beach huts. We have an agent looking into surreptitious use of that. There's a gate with a combination lock at the top, so you can't take vehicles down unless you're having a good day. But there's a portaloo there, and that's probably the easiest end for entering.
It's the most gentle walk back, isn't it, I guess, as well?
Yes, the slope is a bit more gradual. It's quite a long slope, but there's a chair halfway up. Oh, there's a chair halfway up at the other end as well.
Is there?
Yep. Yeah, I remember stopping there to watch you walk up. And it's quite a long walk between the two. That's probably getting on for a quarter of a mile.
It's a very long way.
Yeah. The zigzag path at the west end of town is closest to the big town car park. It's not a terrible walk from the car park if you park at the west end of the car park, and that's the car park. You park at the east end of the car park, which is at the west end of town, and that's the car park that has the loos, the ice cream van, and often the chip van as well. So that's the epicenter of Overstrand. And there's the Clifftop Cafe, which I'm not sure we went to last year.
It changed hands, didn't it? So I think we did once, and I think it was fine. Yeah,
it changed hands. We liked the lady there. She was a diver, although she hadn't dived in Britain. We used to have chats with her. The street here has free parking, and you can just judge the amount of walk you fancy. You can almost always find somewhere here, but by the time you're parking back in sort of the deep town, you may as well just go to the car park and pay for it. If you buy a season ticket for the Norfolk County Council car parks, which work at Weybourne, Sheringham,
East
Runton,
Holt,
yes. They also work at Overstrand. So if you've paid up, then being by the chip van is nice. If you haven't, then you might park on the street, which is fine. And there's also parking at the other end of town on the road, because this is just a screen grab, I can't scroll to. So the main thing here is not to become discouraged and to be very realistic about your prospects. If there's much onshore breeze, because this is a concrete front, the waves really slap around this end of town. If you move away in either direction, where the beach has built up a bit, they tend not to be as severe. But just here, by the easiest slipway at the bottom of the easiest path, or the most obvious path nearest the car park, if there's any kind of onshore breeze, the waves really do slap against the concrete, and it can be a bit unpleasant, and that certainly raises the sand up. And so no trip to Overstrand is complete without standing at the top about here, looking out and checking that there isn't a big brown band that covers everything you're interested in. If it ends by the end of the groins, which is usual, then you're on for a reasonable dive. If it ends before the end of the dive, probably be end of the groin, it'll probably be quite nice. But if the band is 200 to 300 meters wide, it's a day for having ice cream and chips, and perhaps giving it a miss, because this is one of the most easily upset sites, probably rivaled only by Trimmingham, where the sand is light and the chalk is light, and so far we found almost nothing of any significance anyway, so the inducement to go to Trimmingham is that much smaller. Here at least you've got a whole selection of very interesting stuff if you can find it. Okay, that was pretty much all the chat. I haven't force muted anyone. So has anybody got any questions? You can type them in or shout them out.
Hi Rob, it's probably a bit of a daft question, but my local dive sites around St Andrews and Crail, it was absolutely inundated with kelp last year and the year before. And there's so much wash from the waves, you get that sort of nauseous kind of effect. Is there anything around your neck of the woods with similar sort of kelp problems?
Well, there's never a kelp problem. Just because you
no, you're
a bit of a snowflake. I know what you mean, and we don't tend to get kelp on our part of the East Coast. Ever. It exists on pontoons, but we have a short, clear season, or a short, relatively clear season. By Scottish standards, because we should put Pete in context, that Pete's from Scotland, so he has clear water year round and will not understand that our sea doesn't really clear until May offshore, April, end of June inshore. And because of that, there's not enough light for kelp or a perennial large algae to grow. So we can have, I mean, if you drop into our talk about Sheringham, you'll see what we get is meadows. Meadows of low seaweeds, perhaps sort of 6 inches to a foot high. Beautiful stuff, and not the kind of whole sliding seabed that sort of plays with your vomit reflex. So we don't. And you saw on those pictures that I was saying, oh, look, here we are in the shallow part of the site. We're seeing boulders, and you saw how clean they were. And then, here we are on sort of starting to get to chalk that's exposed more. And you saw that little tubular growing. And that's tubular growing in 5 or 6 meters. So in Scotland, that would be still in the kelp zone very much. But here you saw there were little fragments of red algae around it. That's our seaweed under duress. And even when we got out to the big chalk, down there, you were just starting to get little clumps of seaweed. Because the sand here is abrasive and very mobile, you don't tend to get big seaweeds growing in our more like sandy sites. They grow on the more solidly chalky sites, and that's where you'd see bigger seaweeds. I think they are perennial, but they have a definite sort of summer
down to a base.
Yeah. Yeah, a definite summer growing season. When they're beautiful in the summer, they grow up nicely in sort of, I guess, spring, and then autumn they're actually best at. It seems that they've sort of worn off their sort of sloughed off last year's growth, and sort of the meadows are really nice in sort of September, October time, maybe even into November. So great question. Kelp, not a problem. Or anybody else? Oh, it's one of those quiet times, which is fine. You're not forced to say anything at all. If you don't want to say anything, there is a chat on here, which you can sort of fire questions in without speaking out. If people were thinking of doing this, I would say this is not the first site to do in Norfolk. The one we normally recommend first is Sheringham. If you want to do one of the little wrecks, then the Rosalie and the Vera are very nice. Both can be seen at low tide, although normally we dive the Vera at high tide because it's a bit shallow, and the Rosalie at low tide because it's a bigger swim out. So they're easy. There's no navigation there. And if people say, but I've seen metal in other places, I want to see the chalk, we say, well, go to Sheringham, because the whole front at Sheringham, which is probably 2 miles long, you can't miss chalk. There are good and bad bits. It's cleaner than Overstrand, and it's a more gradual, more even slope. So the tidal effects there are quite predictable. If we give you a time, which we tend to during the dive season, it'll be a walk-in time of half an hour before slack. And that way, if you had half an hour before, half an hour after, you've got a nice hour's dive. But on sort of Sheringham Front or somewhere benign like East Runton, you just stay there until you're fed up. There are days when there is no tide. You go in, you just stay in until you want to come out. I've never had a dive like that at Overstrand.
No, not ever. There's always a fierce end to it, isn't there?
And that we say that our dive timings are rule of thumb. And so on the whole, they are okay for the whole length of the stretch of the coast, which is about 20 miles. And logically, mathematically, and hydrographically, that can't be true. It's not true that the slack is always at the same times, but it's as close as needs be on a rule of thumb. And we tune it at the start of the year, depending on sand movements.
And you add half an hour on for Overstrand anyway. It's always later than everywhere else.
Yeah. They're always later, sometimes not later, sometimes more later. Really oppressively annoying. So it can mean that you go, I'll start on time. I'll allow an extra half an hour because sometimes it's a bit late here. And I had dives where I dived for over an hour using the dive time plus half an hour. It was never slack throughout my whole dive until I was ending the dive and getting out. And so literally the slack was an hour and a half later than expected. And I used the same rule of thumb at Cromer and it was fine. So unfortunately, you wouldn't go there as your first sort of novice feeler dive. You'd go to other sites, get used to the way the tide builds up, so the pattern and behavior of the tides. They are, on the whole, very predictable. You go in on a high tide, it'll carry you to the east. The tide goes slack, dies off, and then it'll slowly build and carry you to the west. At Overstrand, sometimes it never dies. It just seems to go, well, I was having a painful dive and it was dragging me in the wrong direction, seemingly fighting against me all the way out. And now, lo and behold, I never noticed, but now I want to go back. It's working against me in that direction as well. I think because of this fall off into that pit behind the beach. We're wondering about oh, Peter's asked another question. We'll deal with that in a moment. We wonder about kayaking out over the top of the deep bit to the shallow chalk. And I think Lucy'd said on the last talk, you knew somebody who might want to go out in a small boat. I think that might be our old small boat. This would be a great place for that, just to get you past those bits or to give you a bit of, I guess, confidence if you were going to go for a big old swim. Pete said, is there a big tidal range? And I mean, some places in Scotland, we see, I mean, there's almost hardly any tidal range at all. And somewhere there is. Here, along the whole run of the coast, there's a spring tidal range of nearly 4 to 5 meters.
Yes, about 4.5, isn't it?
Yeah. At Neeps, that range falls to just over a meter.
Yeah.
Yeah, a meter and a half.
Mm.
So on Neeps, there's not much water moving at all. And because basically the coast is open, it doesn't tend to bunch up and cause sort of funny little pockets of tide, except at Overstrand. We've been to places where clubs have said they've gone to the Rosalie and been carried 7 miles down the coast. And we kind of sort of think, well, that's an achievement.
Yes.
And I think it's sort of people have just gone, today's the day I die, and just let themselves.
I should go with it very fast.
It's not a riptide, and so you're even if you're caught in a tide, you're only swimming back again as far as you've allowed yourself to go out. So I think remain calm. You can get back in, and if you come back to the surface, then you've got all the air you want. We've done some big swims. We've swum 1 kilometre out and come back at Sheringham. So most places are fairly civilized. It's just Overstrand is a bit rough. So build up your experience there. And this would be one of the places that we'd say, do try to GPS track your dives. And perhaps we'll do, so we were thinking of doing the next talk would be a bit of ID. Perhaps we'll choose a group of animals and we'll do a bit of ID chat on that. And maybe we'll do one later on how to GPS map. We have talked about that, haven't we, a bit somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember where it was, but a bit more about GPS mapping, because it's a nice thing to do on one of these sites where there's not a lot of lobster and crab pots. Dragging an SMB out, not so onerous, apart from when the tide gets up. And so, I mean, what we do is we have a GPS app on our phone. We take out an SMB. Nick was saying he's got GPS on his VHF. You can do the same kind of thing. You drag it out, drag it back, download your track, lay it down on top of the bathymetry, which Rob Claxton has made available on the Seasearch East page. And you can see how close you got to things, or if you found something interesting, you can actually say where it was. Because one of the most, I think, enigmatic things is one of our volunteers, who's unfortunately not with us on this talk, found a rotary engine from something, well, from an aircraft, and we've no idea where that is. I think it's somewhere in the middle, because it was...
He won't have gone a huge way, will he?
No, David had, I mean, sticky little arms. He could barely help us with the boat. When we tried to launch the boat,
it got easier when he stopped.
It got easier when he stopped helping. It was very sweet. Yes, I'm not sure I ever saw him bend his arms when he was lifting anything. They were just straight out like pieces of string. So I don't reckon he swam very far, and I reckon it's somewhere in the middle of the site. So groins 2 to 3, I'd say.
You know that we are lazy walkers but happy swimmers, both Inga and I, and carry lots of gas. Have you ever tried going in half hour before and swimming out a long way and then coming back on the tide and playing the tide?
Yes,
like we do
have done that.
Does it work well there?
No. Well, I think if you look at that share screen of the tracks, that's this one.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can see that. I mean, this was an intention to go out, drift from one end to the other. I mean, not a super distant one, and so it can be done. And I think this is where you just build up your experience with Overstrand, so you understood what the tide felt like.
We did do that very long one where we went east at the beginning as hard as we could, and then let the tide bring us back again. That's one where we did.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
At this site.
Yeah, that is true, and I think what we found, it was very sandy.
It was
over
very
the
sandy.
east.
Lots of masked crabs and things, weren't they? It was cool.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly you can ride it out, and perhaps you'd get to cover a decent amount of distance. I think one problem. So let me share something else. Let's have a look.
One problem's getting back in if you go too far.
Yeah.
East.
So if I go to Google Earth, and we can show you a bit more. Getting in if you go west isn't a problem.
No, that's all sandy beach. It's absolutely
Yeah,
fine.
it's all sandy beach, and if the waves are getting up, so you can see that the blue sort of curves out there, and these beaches are easier to come back when the waves are stronger.
And that's the way the tide will always carry you after a high anyway.
True. Yeah, so that's the safe end. There's a wooden barrier here, but that's far enough back that if you're after a high, you'll have a piece of sand to walk on.
Yes, and it's got steps in places anyway.
Yeah. The west end, however, I think it's quite difficult to get back to the back of the beach, because some of the groins down here are actual barricades.
Yeah, they're very high.
Yeah, and the back of the beach,
It's boulders and
there's
things.
boulders built up
And fallen
behind,
cliff.
yeah, behind this barrier, and fallen cliff. So that's more difficult. Although now we've got the bathymetry, look how interesting it is. So this might be stuff that is better approached from a boat or with a plan. We did go just for a beach walk down here, and it's a bit hairy because you want safe exit, and you can be caught by the tide against this stuff if you misjudge it. I suppose at the very least I can zoom in here, and we can say that.
So Rob, if you went in at the west end on a high, you could go northeast off, ferry glide it, hit the slack in the deep, and then come back. And the worst that can happen is you get washed past onto the sandy beach.
Yeah, and then you have to walk with all your gas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've used all the gas by then, you're 4 kilos lighter, but you've got to walk with the rest.
The tide's very unpredictable. We did find the best thing to do was to swim as far east as you could on the slack, and then let the rising tide carry you back, so you could just nip back in wherever it was safe, rather than go with the tide.
Yeah,
because you don't know what it's going to do to you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Just from a point of view, this is Coast Road, and that's where we park to go at this end. The residents around there were a little bit more spiky. We had a very aggravated chap last year sort of wonder what we were doing parking in front of his house. I said, well, you've chosen to live on a street. You've opened yourself up to this kind of thing. But we moved because, to be honest, I didn't want to park outside his house, because you want to be on the front so you're as close as possible to limit the walks. If you park up this end, you can nip through the top of the cliffs, which is quite amusing. But you can see this area is almost all cliff fall. So it seems to be stable at the moment, but it's a bit scabby. And down here, you can see that's the little car park. So if you were going there as a group, you could afford to sort of decamp down here, swap cylinders and stuff. But it's not really viable so much for 2 dives a day on slacks, is it?
No, because you only really want to do it on the high.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's a fun site, lots of variety there, and so it makes a nice change. When we generally think of the reef as being stony up the west end, Cley and Weybourne and Sheringham a bit. Sheringham is sort of half sand. The gravelly end tends to be cleaner, tends to deepen a bit more quickly, aside from Overstrand, but the waves hit it harder. So down the south end, the wave, or from middle to east, the waves tend to hit it more gently. Doesn't always mean you get great viz, but you can get in and out more comfortably. Yes. So there you are. That's roughly Overstrand. Oh, if everybody's sort of happy, we could all break up for tea. Okay. Thanks everybody who came along.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Nice to see you. We're doing these sort of every Wednesday, and they're just supposed to be relaxing chats about things. So if you've got a subject you'd like covered, or we have a site you're particularly interested coming up, and you want to you have a question you've always wanted to ask, you can just mail us or Facebook us beforehand, and we'll try and have answers ready, or feel free to fire them in. We're also doing photographic underwater talks on Fridays, but they're wholly more nerdy, really. They're not for normal people at all. But if you're keen on that kind of thing, they happen as well, and we're putting links in. So thank you ever so much for coming along. Hope we see you all in the summer, whether you're diving or snorkeling or just coming to watch us throw ourselves in. We'd like to see you. And any questions, then do ask. Okay, great. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.